Have you ever stopped to think why precisely where archaeological discoveries emerge that could change the history of Africa? A war coincidentally breaks out. Why have ancient libraries in Mali and pyramids in Sudan become bombing targets under the excuse of collateral damage? Today I'm going to show you a disturbing pattern. The systematic destruction of African heritage is not random barbarity, it's strategy. If you want to understand why the world remains silent while the past of an entire continent is erased, leave yours like and subscribe. Get ready to discover that the war against Africa is not just about resources, but about who has the right to tell the story of humanity. Have you ever wondered why so many archaeological sites in Africa have become targets of conflict and bombing? History reveals that these actions are not mere accidents, but part of a broader strategy to obfuscate the continent's rich cultural and historical tapestry. For decades, archaeologists have discovered that Africa, far from being a land without history, was a cradle of advanced civilizations. In Mali, cities like Djenné and Timbuktu flourished with universities and libraries full of manuscripts that demonstrated profound knowledge in diverse areas, while Europe still struggled with medieval ignorance. The truth is that the presence of these manuscripts and centers of learning challenged the narrative that Africa needed European colonization to become civilized. What few realize is that these discoveries threatened the historical justification for colonization. Under the aegis of the civilizing mission, European powers decimated cultures and stole resources. However, archaeological evidence began to paint a different picture. A vibrant, sophisticated continent with global trade and scientific and astronomical advances that rivaled any other part of the world. Documents prove that in Sudan, ancient temples bore inscriptions that preceded the Egyptian pyramids, suggesting their own rich line of civilizational development. In Zimbabwe, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe demonstrated the existence of a powerful and well-organized kingdom long before the colonial incursions. It turns out that acknowledging this history would have profound implications. If Africa was, in fact, a continent of complex and advanced civilizations, then colonization would be exposed for what it really was, an enterprise of pillage and destruction. And so, a silent but effective campaign began to unfold. While conflicts were fueled in strategic regions, armed groups emerged, apparently disorganized, but with a curious propensity to attack archaeological sites. The reasons given for these attacks were always the same: collateral damage amid widespread violence. The facts reveal that such collateral damage often involved bombings of ancient ruins under the guise of military interventions. However, when the targets are mapped, a disturbing pattern of intentional destruction emerges. The interventions always seem to coincide with sites of archaeological and cultural importance, areas where discoveries could challenge centuries-old colonial and racist narratives. Reality shows that this erasure is not only a blow against African history, but also against humanity itself. Each site destroyed represents not just the loss of a piece of Africa's past, but a global loss of knowledge and shared history. The question remains: how many other truths are buried in the sands of time waiting to be rediscovered, and what forces will continue to oppose this revelation? In 2012, when militants associated with Al-Qaeda took over Timbuktu and began destroying its mausoleums and manuscripts, what was really at stake was the preservation of a history that challenges the dominant narrative about the African continent. The truth is that Timbuktu during the Middle Ages was one of the most advanced intellectual centers in the world, housing a vast collection of manuscripts covering areas such as mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and law. Written by African intellectuals in Arabic and several local languages, these texts were an indisputable testament to the cultural and scientific sophistication of sub-Saharan Africa. What few realize is that the attack on Timbuktu was not just an act of religious fanaticism, but also an attempt to erase a legacy that challenges the Eurocentric view of world history. It turns out that the process of digitizing and translating these manuscripts was underway, with intentions of sharing this knowledge globally and revealing the true greatness of African intellectual production. This imminent exhibition could have profoundly altered the world's perception of African history, and therefore questioned the narratives of cultural superiority that underpinned centuries of colonization and exploration. But conveniently, this heritage was targeted for destruction, silencing voices that for centuries called for recognition. After the devastation, French military intervention, instead of focusing on restoring this legacy, prioritized the political and economic stabilization of the region, guaranteeing, above all, access to mineral resources. The reality shows that the erasure of Timbuktu is part of a broader pattern of selective cultural destruction aimed at maintaining the status quo. In parallel, the destruction of Nubian archaeological sites in 2015 during the conflicts in Sudan and Libya reinforces this trend. The Nubian pyramids, although less known than the Egyptian ones, are more numerous and in some cases older. They represent civilizations that rivaled pharaonic Egypt in power and knowledge. These bombings were justified under the pretext of being close to the rebels' strategic positions. However, archaeologists working in the region say there was no such strategic value to the sites, just ruins that could rewrite important chapters of African history. The facts reveal that these acts of systematic destruction are carefully orchestrated to prevent a new narrative from taking shape, one that recognizes Africa as a cradle of advanced and autonomous civilizations. These events raise questions about the true objective behind the destruction of priceless cultural and historical heritage. The Timbuktu manuscripts and Nubian ruins are more than vestiges of a glorious past. They are symbols of resistance against a history that has been distorted and suppressed. The question remains, until when will the world allow these cultural riches to be erased, hiding from future generations a heritage that belongs to all humanity? In 2011, the world was watching Libya, where a geopolitical drama was about to trigger seismic shifts. The central figure in this plot was Muammar Gaddafi, a leader whose legacy was controversial to say the least. Gaddafi was not just a dictator, he was also an ardent patron of African historical and cultural roots. Under his regime, Libya became a vibrant center for archaeological research. Excavations were funded, museums erected, and researchers across the continent found support to unearth and preserve forgotten chapters of African history. What few realize is that Gaddafi was about to reveal to the world an Africa connected by ancient civilizations, a narrative that contrasted sharply with the prevailing Eurocentric version of history. What really caught the attention of world powers was Gaddafi's proposal to create a unified African currency, a move that could challenge the global economic status quo. He also spoke openly about removing foreign military bases from the continent, an idea that threatened established power structures. But it was his initiative to rewrite African history without the colonial lens that probably sealed his fate. It turns out that during the turbulence of the civil war that led to its downfall, invaluable Libyan archaeological sites were attacked, cultural treasures have disappeared, museums have been looted, and African heritage has suffered a devastating blow. UNESCO, rather than leading a global investigation, issued only notes of condolence as the world watched in silence. The facts reveal that, soon after Gaddafi's fall, the geopolitical chess pieces began to move quickly. Western oil companies returned to Libya, re-establishing their economic influence. Foreign military bases were quickly installed, solidifying the external military presence in the territory. And with that, African archaeology lost one of its greatest defenders. Coincidence? The reality shows a carefully orchestrated strategy. African leaders who dared to invest in reviving their own history were seen as threats. Because after all, history is a powerful tool of identity and, by extension, power. The destruction of these archaeological sites was not only an attack on Libya's cultural heritage, but also an attempt to erase evidence of a deep and intricate link between ancient African civilizations. The key decision made was clear. Rather than allowing these discoveries to challenge established historical narratives, the solution was to obliterate the physical evidence. And so, armed conflicts had become the perfect alibi, a smokescreen for systematic cultural erasure. The question remains, how many other truths buried beneath the desert sands wait to be rediscovered? And what forces will continue to oppose this revelation, fearing the profound impact that a new understanding of the African past could have on the present and future global? The war on African history is not just a metaphor, it is a brutal and silent reality that has unfolded over the last few decades. Evidence indicates that, behind the scenes of the conflicts and interventions that plague the continent, there is a deliberate action to silence archaeological discoveries that could rewrite world history. The story reveals a new form of colonization where cultural identity is directly attacked, not only through narratives but also through the physical destruction of monuments and artifacts that support these stories. Archaeological sites, which should be preserved as humanity's heritage, are transformed into battlefields, where truth is the first victim. Research indicates that Africa has one of the greatest archaeological treasures in the world, with the potential to change the understanding of ancient civilizations. However, whenever something potentially revolutionary is discovered, dark forces come into play. Archaeologists have reported that, as they approach significant discoveries, such as evidence of advanced civilizations in regions such as the Nile Valley or the Sahel, they suddenly face funding cuts or political interference that derail their work. The facts reveal that, in many cases, the destruction of archaeological sites occurs under pretexts of national security or economic development. But the true objective is the erasure of an inconvenient narrative. The truth is that this sabotage is not limited to physical destruction. Documents prove that many studies and research are systematically censored before being released. African archaeologists, who often work under extremely precarious conditions, report that their findings are ignored or undervalued by Western institutions. When their discoveries threaten to challenge established historical conceptions, they face a wall of silence and indifference. The international archaeological community, which should be the guardian of historical truth, often remains silent, fearing reprisals or loss of prestige. It turns out that this silent war is not just against African history, but against the truth itself. By destroying tangible evidence of a rich and complex past, we are denying humanity the opportunity to learn from that legacy. What's more, a distorted view of history is being perpetuated that favors specific economic and political interests. The silent turn, therefore, is a call to global consciousness. It is a reminder that cultural erasure is not just a loss for Africa, but for the entire world. For each stone thrown down, each artifact lost, is a chapter in the history of humanity that closes, perhaps forever. The question that remains is, how much longer will these actions be allowed to continue with impunity? And who will have the courage to face this silent current of destruction and stand up in defense of a heritage that belongs to all of us? The deliberate destruction of African archaeological sites is not a collateral detail of the conflicts ravaging the continent, but a meticulously calculated strategy to maintain the hegemony of a Eurocentric historical narrative. Every ruin demolished, every manuscript burned, is more than a cultural loss. It is an intentional erasure of evidence that defies centuries of imperialist propaganda. What few realize is that many of these sites, such as the ancient cities of Meroe in Sudan or the ruins of Caral in Mali, contain evidence of civilizations that rivaled in complexity and development those of Egypt and Mesopotamia. These sites not only confirm the sophistication of African societies, but also expose the myth that the continent needed European intervention to achieve civilization. The facts reveal that recognizing the true history of Africa would have profound consequences. Firstly, it would require a historical reckoning, where countries that participated in colonialism would have to admit that their actions were less about bringing civilization and more about destruction and merciless exploitation. This, in turn, would lead to a call for reparations, not just financial but cultural and historical, by returning looted artifacts that fill the showcases of museums in London, Paris, and Berlin. Furthermore, it would force a rewriting of the history books, incorporating the African narrative as an integral part of world history, and not as an exotic appendage. It turns out that this admission of guilt and subsequent restructuring of global knowledge challenges the status quo. Colonialism was not just a matter of territorial domination, but also a campaign to control the historical narrative. Controlling history is controlling identity, and controlling identity is controlling the future. Therefore, the destruction of archaeological sites is a tool to preserve the cultural hegemony. The solution found by world powers is to erase the evidence, delegating responsibility to terrorist groups or justifying it as collateral damage in armed conflicts, when in fact, many of these actions are part of a coordinated operation to prevent the true narrative from coming to light. Studies indicate that targets are often precisely those places where discoveries could rewrite history. In Mali, for example, Timbuktu's libraries housed manuscripts documenting a time when the city was a center of knowledge, attracting scholars from across Africa. In Sudan, the pyramids of Meroe reveal an empire that flourished parallel to pharaonic Egypt, but was systematically ignored in Western curricula. The destruction of these treasures is not an accident, but a conscious effort to ensure that history remains as written by colonizers. Reality shows that the erasure of the African past is a form of neo-colonialism, where control is not exercised only by force, but by the manipulation of collective memory. It is an attempt to keep Africa in the role of a continent on the margins of the world historical narrative. The question that emerges is, how long will this strategy of cultural erasure be tolerated? And what will be the cost, not just to Africa, but to all humanity, if true history continues to be buried beneath the ruins of time? The deliberate destruction of archaeological sites in Africa is more than a simple loss of cultural heritage. It is a calculated attack on the very identity of the African people. When manuscripts in Timbuktu were burned, not only paper and ink were lost, but centuries of knowledge about medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, written by intellectuals who, in their time, rivaled the most renowned on the globe. These documents were symbols of an age of enlightenment that many tried to erase from the historical record. The reality is that every temple destroyed in Sudan was not just a physical structure, but living proof that the African continent was ahead in terms of engineering and astronomy, challenging the Eurocentric narrative that Africa was always behind in development. What few realize is that each artifact stolen from Libya amounts to a chapter of African history that has been ripped from their hands and taken to foreign museum showcases where the narrative can be controlled and manipulated. These objects are not just museum pieces, they are part of a living narrative that connects the present to the past, a direct line that allows new generations to understand and be proud of their roots. Stealing these artifacts is like cutting the roots of a tree, leaving it without sustenance and eventually destined to wither. The truth is that the most devastating loss is the psychological one. When a people's history is destroyed, their identity is shattered. A people without history is a people without pride, without a sense of belonging. This is not just a cultural loss, it is a tactic of social control. A group deprived of its heritage is more susceptible to ideological manipulations, easier to convince of its alleged inferiority, simpler to keep in poverty and under domination. Ancestral pride is a powerful weapon of resistance, and by quenching it, these forces ensure that the chains of oppression remain intact. The facts reveal that this destruction is not a recent phenomenon, but rather a centuries-old strategy that continues to unfold today. From the colonial era, when European powers saw Africa as a continent to be explored and dominated, to contemporary conflicts that serve as a smokescreen for looting and destruction. Historical documents show that the intentional fragmentation of African identity was planned. Over the centuries, colonization was not only territorial, but also cultural. And the destruction of archaeological sites is an extension of this same logic. The question remains, who wins when history is erased? Who benefits from a continent that cannot tell its own story? The answer is clear. The same people who profited from colonial exploitation continue to profit from ignorance and division. Historical erasure is a form of neo-colonialism, a way of perpetuating subjugation over time. What needs to be done is clear. It is up to the global community to recognize this attack on history and work to restore what was lost. The return of stolen artifacts is just the beginning. We need to invest in research and preservation, support local archaeologists, and ensure that the true story of Africa is told. Because in the end, history does not belong to a nation or a people, but to humanity as a whole. And the ultimate question is, are we ready to face this truth and act accordingly? African resistance against the destruction of its archaeological heritage is a struggle silent but powerful. On a continent where history has often been distorted or erased, a dedicated group of archaeologists, historians, and activists are rising up to protect and preserve what remains of their cultural heritage. These individuals not only face the monumental challenge of documenting and saving at-risk artifacts, but they also strive to rewrite historical narratives in authentic and decolonized ways. With the help of modern technologies like drones and 3D scanners, they are recording archaeological sites in meticulous detail, creating digital repositories that resist time and physical destruction. The truth is that the use of these technologies not only preserves crucial information, but also democratizes access to knowledge. Previously restricted to specialists or held in Western institutions, this data is now becoming accessible to local communities and academics around the world. What few realize is that digitizing the Timbuktu manuscripts, for example, not only protects these documents from physical damage, but also allows their ideas and discoveries to spread globally, challenging the Eurocentric narratives that have historically marginalized African knowledge. It turns out that this new generation of defenders of African cultural heritage is also dedicated to educating and inspiring the next generations. They are creating online learning platforms and running workshops in local communities, teaching young Africans about the rich tapestry of their ancestral stories. Not only does this strengthen cultural identity, but it also arms these young people with the knowledge they need to question and challenge dominant narratives that try to diminish them. The reality shows that education is a powerful tool of resistance, and by reigniting pride in the achievements of their ancestors, these activists are planting seeds for lasting change. The facts reveal that resistance is not only against physical destruction, but also against cultural amnesia. By documenting and sharing these stories, they are ensuring that collective memory is not lost, that future Africans grow up knowing the true greatness of their ancestors. History reveals that every effort to preserve and teach the true narrative of Africa is a blow against the legacy of colonialism, which sought to erase these stories to justify its actions. But with each young man who rediscovers his roots and becomes a keeper of his own past, the narrative begins to change. Evidence suggests that international collaboration also plays a vital role in this effort. Universities and research institutions around the world are joining these efforts, offering technical and financial support, but more importantly, respecting the leadership and vision of African archaeologists. This equitable partnership is beginning to redress some of the historic injustices and build a future where African heritage is protected and celebrated globally. Resistance and the rescue of African history are not just an archaeological mission, but a social and political movement. It is a declaration that Africa will not be defined solely by the traumas of colonialism, but by the resilience and innovation of its people. The question that arises is, how far can this movement go, and how many minds can it awaken to the truth of a story that can no longer be silenced? The digital media revolution is challenging the global narrative about African cultural heritage. While the destruction of sites in the Middle East receives international attention, Africa remains largely invisible to traditional media. The question that arises is, why this disparity? What few realize is that, with the rise of the internet, a new dynamic has emerged in which previously silenced Africans have begun to share their own archaeological discoveries, narratives and stories directly with the world. This democratization of information breaks the monopoly of the major media and calls into question the selectivity with which cultural heritage is reported globally. The reality shows that Africans are using digital platforms to document and disseminate their stories, promoting a cultural and identity revival that challenges centuries of Eurocentric narratives. What is at stake is more than simply preserving artifacts. It is the recovery of a historical identity that has been systematically erased. Documents show that European museums house thousands of African artifacts, many of them acquired through looting during the colonial period. However, when faced with requests for repatriation, the response is often one of refusal or indefinite procrastination. It turns out that the return of these artifacts is not merely a matter of historical justice, but symbolizes the return of the dignity and narrative of a people. Museums in London, Paris, and Berlin, for example, have become showcases for colonial plunder, as Africa struggles to reconstruct its past and tell it in its own words. Furthermore, growing pressure to repatriate African artifacts is fueled by a global sense of outrage. Why is the Parthenon marble a central topic of diplomatic discussions, while Benin masks remain untouched in Western museums? This duality of treatment reveals not only the hypocrisy of cultural institutions, but also a reluctance to accept Africa as an integral and equal part of global history. Studies indicate that the repatriation of artifacts is not just a matter of historical rectification, but an opportunity to rewrite a narrative that has been distorted by colonial interests. Evidence suggests that this pressure is not only coming from within Africa, but also from international voices demanding cultural justice. Universities and academics around the world are increasingly engaged in this fight, using their platforms to amplify the call for a reassessment of museum practices. It turns out that times are changing, and the pressure that builds cannot be ignored indefinitely. The internet plays a crucial role in this scenario, facilitating the organization of campaigns, petitions, and social movements that demand a reassessment of Africa's place in world history. History reveals that real change begins when the dominant narrative is challenged, and that is exactly what is happening. The question is not just about the return of artifacts, but about what this return represents. The recognition of Africa as a cradle of complex civilizations and cultures, the erasure of which can no longer be tolerated. The accumulated pressure could be the catalyst for a new era of cultural connection and global recognition. The real question is the world ready to embrace this change and rewrite history in a fair and inclusive way? What is the price of an Africa aware of its true greatness? For many, the answer appears to be silence imposed through systematic cultural destruction. The issue is not just preventing Africa from recovering its history, but preventing the continent from claiming its rightful place on the global stage. When recognition of a glorious past threatens to dismantle existing power structures, the reaction is to erase that memory before it can inspire a future of resistance and autonomy. The reality shows that the erasure of African history is not a random error, but a meticulously orchestrated strategy to maintain control. The truth is that an Africa aware of its roots, rich in ancient civilizations and advanced knowledge, challenges the colonizing narrative of a primitive continent in need of civilization. This deeply ingrained narrative not only justified brutal exploitation, but continues to fuel policies of economic and military domination that perpetuate the status quo. Documents prove that each archaeological site bombed, each library burned, is more than a loss of art and knowledge. These are targeted attacks to dismantle ownership of a past that could, in African hands, catalyze radical transformation. Because after all, an Africa that knows and values its legacy is an Africa that refuses to be subjugated. It no longer bows to unpayable debts imposed by international financial institutions, nor does it accept foreign military bases that guarantee the continued plundering of its resources. The facts reveal that cultural destruction is a powerful tool for maintaining the global power structure. Without a solid past, a people are easily manipulated, convinced of their inferiority, and deprived of their agency. And so, erasure becomes a form of invisible domination, where control is exercised not just through military force, but through the erosion of identity. The question remains, if a people do not know their history, how can they fight for a different future? Evidence suggests that resistance to this destruction is growing. Archaeologists and cultural activists across the continent are uniting, challenging forces that seek to erase their histories. They are reconstructing narratives, recovering artifacts, and insisting on a rewriting of history that includes African voices. However, the fight is uneven, with many facing threats and hostilities that aim to silence them. History reveals that the destruction of archaeological sites is not just an attack on the past, but an attempt to control the future. By depriving Africa of its roots, the aim is to disarm it of its ability to project a sovereign destiny. But the question that really matters is, how long will the world close its eyes to this strategy of cultural erasure? And what will happen when Africa finally stands up and demands recognition? What does it deserve? The answer may be the dawn of a new era of historic justice and global balance. What is the true intention behind the bombings aimed at destroying archaeological sites in Africa? These attacks, often disguised as collateral damage, reveal a silent war against the memory and identity of a continent that, over the centuries, has bravely resisted erasure. The reality shows that these attacks are not isolated incidents or the result of chance, but part of a deliberate strategy to control the historical narrative and thus maintain current power structures. When Africa is deprived of its past, it is prevented from claiming its rightful place on the global stage. Every ruin demolished, every manuscript burned, is part of an effort to ensure that the story told remains one-sided and unfavorable to the African continent. The facts reveal that throughout history, cultural destruction has been a powerful tool of domination. By erasing the evidence of a rich civilizational tapestry, the world attempts to perpetuate the image of an Africa lacking in culture and history. But what few realize is that, in fact, Africa has always been a cradle of knowledge and innovation. The universities of Timbuktu, the temples of Meroe, and the pyramids of Kush are just a few examples of a legacy that rivals any other ancient civilization. The destruction of these cultural treasures is not only a loss for Africa, but for all humanity, which is deprived of a crucial part of its common heritage. It turns out that, by destroying these tangible proofs of greatness, we seek to weaken the self-esteem and identity of African peoples. A continent that is unaware of its own history is more easily manipulated, convinced of its inferiority, and therefore more susceptible to continued exploitation. However, African resilience is undeniable. Even in the face of destruction, local communities continue to preserve their stories through oral tradition and cultural resistance. Hidden manuscripts, maintained traditions, and a collective memory that refuses to be erased are testaments to the resilience of a people who never accepted being silenced. The truth is that history does not just belong to the winners, it belongs to all those who have the courage to remember, preserve, and fight for its legacy. And as long as there are those who stand up to protect these narratives, the war against African memory will never be won. Furthermore, the responsibility to protect this heritage lies not only with Africans, but with all of humanity. Because when you destroy the history of one part of the world, everyone loses. It is a loss to collective knowledge, a gap that cannot be filled. So the question remains, are you prepared to accept this truth? Are you willing to challenge the dominant narrative and recognize the intrinsic value of African history? Because in doing so, you not only honor a glorious past, but also contribute to a future of justice and equality. And this is a truth that, no matter how hard they try to suppress, will always find a way to emerge. Resistance to cultural destruction is a testament to the strength and indomitable spirit of a continent that, despite all adversity, continues to tell its own story. And this time, the truth will not be silenced.